I've never been a man who goes looking for trouble. After retiring from the military at 52, all I wanted was peace. I bought my land, every acre of it, with savings I'd earned over a lifetime of disciplined grit and more deployments than I care to count. I picked a quiet, rugged stretch of land on the edge of an HOA-controlled development called Fairview Trails, but legally separate. My ranch sat just outside their governing boundaries, a detail that would later become the heart of a storm I never saw coming. My days were filled with sweat dust and the quiet thunder of bison hooves. I'd started with 6, but by the time this story began, I had 22, most of them bulls. My boys. They were proud creatures, moody and majestic, and I respected them the same way I had respected the sergeants that once barked orders in war zones. You don't provoke them, you don't surprise them, and you damn sure don't try to enter their territory uninvited. The first sign of trouble came, wrapped in pastel pink and the smell of lavender. Her name was Karen Whitmore, and I could hear her before I saw her. The HOA president. Her SUV idled at the end of my gravel drive, the same way a snake coils before striking. I'd been stringing wire along the eastern fence line when she got out, heels clicking against dirt like she owned the place. "Excuse me," she called, voice sharp as a nail. "This fence violates the community's visual standards." I stood slowly, my boots grinding into the dry soil. I wiped sweat from my brow with the back of my glove and said as evenly as I could, "Ma'am, you're on private land." She blinked. "What? This isn't Fairview Trails property. This ranch is outside the HOA's jurisdiction." She smiled the kind of smile that meant she hadn't listened to a word I said. "Well, it's close enough. And you're right next to the main entrance. Your fencing is an eyesore. Not to mention, those animals could be dangerous. They're bison, and they're mine." Her lips puckered like she'd just tasted vinegar. "I'll be reporting this. There's no need to be difficult." And just like that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her car, her clipboard tucked under one arm, like she was issuing a fine in a war zone. I watched her go, heart rate steady, jaw tight. I'd seen her type before commanders who thought the world saluted them just because of the badge on their chest. Over the next few weeks, things escalated quietly, like a storm building beyond the horizon. I started getting letters. Official-looking envelopes tucked into my gate mailbox, even though I wasn't on their mailing list. Fines for non-compliant exterior fencing. Notices about livestock concerns. One even demanded I remove unauthorized structures, referring presumably to my barn, that had been there longer than the HOA itself. I took the first few to my lawyer, a scrappy guy named Ellis, who loved paperwork more than breathing. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said after flipping through the stack. "Your land's recorded in the county as fully exempt. No deed restrictions, no HOA easement, but if they keep pushing, we may need to issue a cease and desist." I nodded. Let them play their little games. I've seen worse. But it wasn't just mail. I began to notice things. A drone hovering over my pastures. Trash dumped along my eastern fence. One of my water lines tampered with poorly, but enough to cost me a day's labor. I couldn't prove it was the HOA, but it reeked of intimidation. And then came the neighborhood meeting. I wasn't invited, obviously. But Marla Jennings, a local resident, whose property bordered mine, stopped by the ranch the day after. She brought a box of honeycomb from her backyard hives and an apologetic look on her face. "They talked about you for nearly 30 minutes, she said, placing the box on my workbench. "Karen had this whole slideshow. Called your place a visual hazard and said the bison were a liability waiting to happen. Tried to rally them to file a collective complaint." I chuckled darkly. It's a good thing opinions aren't law. Marla looked uneasy. "You might want to be careful. She's got friends on the board, and she mentioned something about dealing with the animal situation directly." That made me pause. I'd seen enough to know when words like that meant someone was about to do something stupid. So I reinforced the gate, replaced the lock with a keypad system, and added an extra layer of wire around the pastures. I also installed 2 more cameras, motion activated with night vision and direct cloud upload. Paranoia wasn't a disorder out here. It was insurance. I didn't want war. I'd spent too many years in places where war was unavoidable. But I knew how to defend my territory, and I knew when a line was being tested. Karen hadn't just crossed it. She was picking at it, scraping away the edges, daring me to push back. And I would, just not in the way she expected. One morning, I found tire tracks along the southern side of my ranch near the fence that faced the HOA's common area. Someone had driven up to the wire in the night. Close. Too close. And from the way the ground was torn up, it looked like they'd tried to turn around in a hurry. I stood there for a long time staring at the ruts in the earth, heart thudding with a mix of anger and resolve. The bulls stood in the distance, quiet and still, their breath steaming in the early morning chill. They didn't like being disturbed. Neither did I. The first time Karen actually set foot past the gate, it was just after dawn on a Saturday morning. I was inside the barn laying fresh straw for the calves when I heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel, too slow to be a delivery truck, too confident to be someone lost. By the time I stepped out, she was already halfway up the drive, walking like she owned the place. Her SUV sat idling crookedly outside the gate rear tire, half off the dirt. She was wearing a white blouse, too clean for a ranch, large sunglasses that screamed suburban intimidation, and of course, a shiny HOA badge clipped to her breast pocket, like she was on some kind of federal mission. She had a camera in one hand and a manila folder in the other. "Good morning," she said as if this were a planned meeting. "I need to do an on-site inspection. Some of your structures may be encroaching on shared easement lines." I stepped off the barn porch and walked slow boots firm against the gravel. "You're trespassing." Karen didn't flinch. She took a photo of my barn. "This will only take a few minutes. It's for documentation." I stopped 5 feet from her. The bulls were grazing in the east field, far enough not to be a threat, but they watched her like they could sense the disturbance. I didn't yell, didn't raise my voice, just pointed calmly to the signs nailed to the fence. "Private property. No trespassing livestock area. Enter at own risk." "You ignored the signs," I said. "This is not part of Fairview Trails. You don't have any jurisdiction here." Karen tilted her head, condescending. "Sir, as president of the HOA, I am obligated to enforce regulations that impact community appearance and safety. Your livestock and fencing are visible from HOA land, which makes them subject to review." I blinked. "Is that in the law or just in your binder?" She bristled. "The board has decided your presence reduces the overall value of Fairview Trails homes. This situation is not sustainable." There it was, the truth behind the clipboard. My ranch, my bison, my way of life. They were too real, too wild, too uncontrolled for people like her. Karen needed tidy lawns, pressure-washed driveways, plastic flamingos facing the same direction. Anything outside that structure made her itch. "You need to leave," I said. She looked past me, raising her camera again toward the barn. "Is that a wood-burning stove vent? Do you have environmental permits for animal waste disposal? Runoff like that could make its way into the HOA-maintained creek." I stepped between her and the barn, not aggressive, just solid. "Last warning, ma'am." That's when she made her second mistake. She tried to push past me. Not hard, not a shove, but her hand brushed my arm like she thought she could move me out of her way. Reflex made me stiffen, a wave of muscle memory rippling from 1,000 mornings in combat boots. I didn't move, just looked her straight in the eyes. Karen froze, hands still in the air, and for a second I saw something flicker behind her oversized sunglasses. Fear. Or was it just the realization that she'd gone too far? She pulled back and smoothed her blouse like nothing happened. "You'll be hearing from our legal department." And then she turned, walked back to her car, and drove off without another word. I watched her go, arms crossed, heart hammering with something deeper than frustration. A boundary had been crossed, not just physically, but symbolically. This wasn't going to stop with letters and photos. That afternoon, I called Ellis again. "She walked onto your property," he said, flipping through papers over the phone. "Passed 3 signs, took pictures, talked about easement lines and runoff." He sighed. "Time to get proactive. I'll draft a notice. You'll post it on the gate, legal cease, and desist violation of property rights. If she tries again, we call the sheriff, no hesitation." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "She's escalating. Then we'll escalate within the law." The cease and desist went up the next morning in a clear plastic sleeve, laminated against weather bolted to the gate beside the camera notice. It quoted county codes, referenced land surveys, and included Ellis's law office number in bold red ink. I also installed a new trail cam that caught her SUV approaching the gate twice in the next week, but never entering again. Still, I could feel her watching. A few days later, someone tagged my mailbox with a sticker. HOA Trash Zone. Real mature. I peeled it off and tossed it into the fire barrel. But the message was clear. Karen wanted a war, and she was starting with paper cuts. I kept my distance from the neighborhood after that. No more farmers market visits or checking in with Marla's honey stand. Every time I drove past Fairview Trail's entrance, I caught a glimpse of HOA flyers taped to the community board. One of them had a blurry photo of my bulls behind the fence, captioned, "Dangerous livestock next to our homes, HOA seeking solution." The implication was obvious. They were going to paint me as the threat, the outsider, the problem that needed fixing. What they didn't know, what Karen was too proud to research, was that I had every right to that land. And more than that, I had friends at the county level who weren't impressed by HOA tantrums. One of them was a man named Bill Ramirez, the current Wildlife and Agriculture Zoning Director. He and I had served in the same unit 20 years ago. I sent him a quiet message with photos, coordinates, and HOA documents. He replied within hours, "You're fine. Let me know if they try anything with zoning. We'll shut it down fast." That gave me a bit of breathing room. I needed it. Because what happened next wasn't just a letter or a visit. It was full-blown madness. And it began with the sound of an engine, the squeal of tires, and the unmistakable roar of a V6 SUV, breaking every rule of common sense. Karen came back. And this time, she didn't stop at the gate. It was a Wednesday, late afternoon. I remember because the sun had just started dipping behind the ridge, and the bison were making their slow march toward the shade trees by the north pasture. I was fixing a busted water line near the barn when I heard the crunch of tires much closer than they should have been. Too close. I dropped the wrench and jogged around the barn, my boots pounding hard against the dry earth. As I rounded the corner, the sight that met me stopped me dead in my tracks. Karen's red SUV had plowed right through the main gate. She didn't break it. She'd somehow input a code. One of the old ones, maybe. I hadn't thought to update it after the electrician visited a few weeks prior. That was on me. The gate hung slightly ajar, a bolt bent, where the frame had clipped her bumper. And there she was, 30 yards into the pasture road, engine still running, windows rolled up, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was in a wildlife documentary. But she wasn't filming lions. She was surrounded by bison. 3 of the bulls had already turned to face her. Shoulders squared, massive heads, tilted, low nostrils flaring. They weren't charging. Yet. I didn't have time to yell. I sprinted toward her, waving both arms like I was directing a helicopter in a landing zone. "Back up, Karen, back up." Whether she heard me or not, I'll never know. Maybe she thought she could reason with the herd. Maybe she thought her HOA badge gave her diplomatic immunity. What I do know is that she did the dumbest thing imaginable. She honked. The horn echoed like a gunshot across the open field. The lead bull, Boone, a 10-year-old with a torn ear and a scar across his snout, took a slow step forward. Then another. Then he let out a low, guttural bellow that sent every hair on my arms standing upright. "Get out of the car," I shouted. "Do not move!" But Karen, in true HOA fashion, rolled down the window and screamed, "Get your animals under control." I froze helpless. And then the bulls moved. It wasn't a stampede. It was precise, intentional. Boone charged, first head-down hooves thundering like a 100-pound drumbeat across the soil. He slammed into the side panel of the SUV with a deafening crunch of metal. The car rocked violently on its suspension. Karen shrieked inside, ducking beneath the dashboard. A second bull followed Tex, my biggest male. He lunged at the rear quarter panel, his horns catching the edge of the taillight and lifting the vehicle momentarily off its back wheels. Dust exploded around them. The engine screamed as Karen must have pressed the gas out of panic, but the tires spun uselessly in the soft dirt. I ran toward the fence line, shouting Boone's name like it would mean anything. I had no weapon, no prod, no flare, nothing but my voice. The bulls circled the SUV like it was prey. Boone backed up, snorted, and slammed forward, again this time catching the door. Metal folded inward like foil. The side mirror tore off and skittered across the pasture. That was the moment Karen finally opened the driver's door and tumbled out. She ran. Not far, maybe 10 feet, before she tripped on her own heels and hit the ground hard. Her scream was pure high-pitched terror, the kind that shreds the back of your throat. I vaulted the outer fence and kept running arms wide, voice deep, trying to redirect the herd. I wasn't yelling words anymore, just raw sound. Instinct. Command. The kind of noise that comes from years of barking over engines and explosions. Boone halted, breathing heavy, his broad chest heaving. Tex pawed at the dirt, but didn't advance. For a long moment, it was a standstill, me the bulls. Karen curled on the ground, sobbing into her blazer. Then slowly they backed off. Not because of me, not really. It was because they were done. Bison don't chase for fun. They send messages, and hers had been received loud and clear. I got to her, crouched low. "Are you hurt?" She stared at me through tear-streaked makeup, clutching her purse like a life preserver. "Your monsters tried to kill me." "They're animals," I said coldly. "On private property. You drove into their territory. I'm going to the hospital, and then I'm calling the sheriff and animal control and the board. You'll do whatever you want," I said. "But next time you think about trespassing, remember that sign you ignored. The one that said, 'Enter at your own risk.'" I stood and backed away, giving her room. She limped to her SUV, which now looked like it had been through a demolition derby. 2 side panels dented beyond repair. A back window cracked like a spiderweb. 1 tire hissing air. But it still started. She didn't look back as she drove away, wheels spinning out in a rush of gravel and fury. I stood there for a long time after she was gone. The bison had already returned to the shade. Boone gave me a slow glance, then resumed grazing. He'd done his job. The next morning, I woke up to 3 voicemails from HOA members, thinly veiled threats, demands for restitution declarations, that I had endangered a board member. But I wasn't rattled. I downloaded the footage from the security cameras. Every second, every moment. The gate, the SUV, the horn, the bulls, the aftermath. And I backed it up to 3 separate cloud drives. Because I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to admit fault. No, she was the type to double down. And I was ready for her. The morning after the incident, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Ellis, my attorney. I didn't bother with pleasantries. She drove onto my land through the bison field, got her car tossed around like a chew toy. I have footage. There was silence on the other end for a beat, then a low whistle. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "She's not." Physically, she walked away. "But she's going to come at me legally. You can bet on that. Send me the footage. All of it. I'll start drafting preemptive filings, and I want the GPS coordinates for your gate, your outer perimeter, and your posted signage. Let's lock this down before she spins a narrative." "Already did," I said. And Ellis. This wasn't an accident. She came in with intent. She thought she could film something to use against me until Boone set her straight. The second call was to Bill Ramirez. He picked up on the first ring. "Tell me she didn't actually do it." "She did." A long pause. "Then send the footage. I'll get ahead of any false animal cruelty claims. You're covered under the Wildlife Preservation Co-Property Act, Section 12B. She stepped onto federally protected livestock grounds. If she tries to bring animal control, we'll shut it down before the first truck leaves the depot." Bill didn't speak like a bureaucrat. He spoke like a man who'd seen things like me. We'd served in Kandahar together. He had my back now, same as he did then. Within the hour, I had 3 copies of the footage uploaded to secure links and forwarded to both men. I also printed screenshots from the drone footage showing the warning signs, the gate breach, the bull's behavior, and Karen's reckless actions. By noon, I had an official legal notice drafted on Ellis's letterhead, which I laminated and posted outside the gate right below the old warning. Notice: any unauthorized entry onto this property is considered criminal trespassing under County Ordinance 42.3 and Wildlife Protection Code 11A. Trespassers may be subject to legal action, civil penalties, and endangerment liability. Violators proceed at their own risk. I installed a second trail cam, this time high in the pine tree overlooking the west fence. I added floodlights with motion sensors, and I finally replaced the old keypad code with a new one this time, generated randomly, never reused, and known only to me and the feed supplier. I wasn't just protecting land. I was preparing for a siege, because sure enough, that very night the fire started. It wasn't a real fire, thank God. It was digital. Karen had gone straight to the Fairview Trails HOA newsletter with a full-page incident report complete with heavily edited screenshots and a story so twisted it was practically fiction. She claimed she was inspecting possible environmental violations when my agitated livestock attacked her. She described the bulls as rogue, said they surrounded her vehicle, and that she narrowly escaped with her life. She made no mention of gate signs or her decision to honk like she was summoning Satan. The cherry on top, She accused me of neglect, saying my poor animal control posed a serious threat to community safety. She demanded the board consider immediate action, including livestock removal or mandatory fencing realignment. It was laughable. It was slanderous. And it spread like wildfire. That night, I got 10 voicemails from residents, some supportive, some furious. One woman asked if my bison had tasted blood. Another shouted at me for bringing danger to the neighborhood. A man named Greg, who I'd never even met, called me a liability to property values. Marla Jennings stopped by the next day, tight-lipped and pale. She's calling an emergency board meeting, she told me, standing just outside the gate. She wants to pass a motion to involve the sheriff and demand a full investigation. She can demand all she wants, I said, arms crossed. This land doesn't answer to her, and neither do I. Marla looked tired. I know, but you're dealing with more than just her now. She's dragging the whole board into it. And a few of them, they don't care what's legal. They care what looks good. Image, optics, property values. The real gods of the HOA world. But I didn't worship them. Ellis filed the first official notice that afternoon, a preemptive restraining order against Karen for unlawful trespass and harassment. He sent copies to the county clerk, the sheriff's department, and the Fairview Trails HOA headquarters. Bill Ramirez, meanwhile, sent a formal declaration from the Wildlife and Agriculture Office, verifying that my land qualified as a livestock-protected private preserve under county and federal designation. In legal terms, that meant any entry. Without my written consent was not only trespassing, it could be considered wildlife interference, a Class C misdemeanor minimum. Karen had just picked a fight with the wrong animal. And I wasn't talking about the bulls. I spent the next few days reviewing every inch of my land. I reflagged my outer boundaries, updated the trail cams, added new gravel along the main road so fresh tire tracks would stand out clearly. I even started carrying my old field journal again, a habit from Afghanistan, logging any strange activity, suspicious vehicles, or unannounced visitors. Then came the envelope. Thick, certified, hand-delivered by a courier who refused to meet my eyes. It was a lawsuit, filed on behalf of Karen Whitmore, president of the Fairview Trails HOA. Negligent livestock management leading to emotional trauma and vehicular damage. Relief sought, reimbursement for vehicle damages, pain and suffering, and mandatory livestock relocation or removal under community safety concerns. She was suing me. Not just threatening, not just bluffing, suing. It was official now. And what she didn't realize was that by bringing this into a courtroom, she had just given me everything I needed. Because if there's one thing I learned in the Army and later in life, it's this. You never start a fight. But if someone insists on one, you finish it. I've always believed that animals can sense intent, especially the ones who've never been tamed. You can hide a smile from a neighbor or a lie from your spouse, but you can't hide fear, rage, or arrogance from a bison. Boone Tex and the rest of the herd weren't house pets. They were 5,000-pound sentinels bred by the land itself. You respect them, or you regret it. Karen never got that. The day after I received her lawsuit, I walked the fence line before sunrise, as I did every morning. The air was cool, clean, laced with pine and manure. The bulls stood clustered by the north pasture, their breath clouds in the dim light, tails swishing in rhythm. They were calm again, but alert, like they knew the tension hadn't passed. I hadn't yet responded to the lawsuit. Ellis and I were building our response meticulously. We weren't going to just reject the claim, we were going to dismantle it, piece by piece. But that didn't stop Karen from escalating in the court of public opinion. She went on a media tour. A few days after the suit was filed, a local community concerns blog posted an article titled, HOA President Traumatized by Ranch Incident. It featured a photo of Karen makeup pristine in front of her twisted SUV. The headline was dramatic, the content even more so. She feared for her life, it read. She was just doing her job. There was no mention of the gate, no mention of the trespassing, no mention of the honking or the fact that she'd driven directly into a herd of wild bison without permission. But the worst part, there was a new motion from the HOA board proposed and fast-tracked by Karen calling for emergency mitigation of neighboring livestock threats. A few of the HOA board members co-signed it. They weren't just suing me anymore. They were trying to rewrite the zoning language around livestock rights. And I knew what that meant. If they pulled it off even partially, It could set a precedent. I'd be forced to build 10-foot electrified fencing or relocate the bulls entirely. Some board members even floated the idea of mandatory animal insurance for adjacent landowners, a backdoor tactic to financially gut people like me. They couldn't take my land, so they were going to try and choke it. I was furious, but I wasn't about to act out of anger. I knew how to fight strategically. That afternoon, I walked out into the field with Boone. He stood near the tree line, broad and unblinking, the scar on his face catching the light. I crouched near him a few feet away. He didn't move, just snorted softly like he was exhaling the very history of the plains. "You feel it too, don't you, old boy?" I murmured. "They're pushing, coming for what's not theirs." He pawed the earth once, a slow, deep scrape. I took it as agreement. The next morning, I filed a countersuit. Ellis helped me craft every word like a scalpel. Intentional trespass, attempted defamation, harassment, emotional distress, and endangerment of protected livestock. We included time-stamped footage from 3 separate cameras. We attached weather reports confirming clear visibility. And most damning of all, we included high-resolution photos of the 6 posted warning signs that Karen had passed before entering the property. We also submitted a written statement from Bill Ramirez confirming that the bison were part of a legally recognized heritage preservation program and protected under federal statutes. But it wasn't just paperwork. I went further. I invited a local wildlife conservationist to the ranch, Dr. Meredith Klein, a respected figure with the state's Department of Natural Resources. She came with a camera crew and documented the bison in their natural environment, explaining how these animals were not just livestock, but cultural treasures of the American plains. The video went viral. A week later, Karen's story began to fall apart. People began commenting. Why was she on private land? Did she ignore signs? Why was she in the bison field in the first place? The pressure built. News channels that had once shown sympathy started reaching out to me for interviews. I declined, let the footage speak for itself. But the tide was turning. Karen, in desperation, doubled down again. She returned. Not onto my land this time. She wasn't that foolish. But she stood at the outer fence line with 2 camera operators and a property safety inspector hired by the HOA. She shouted across the field, demanding I come speak to her. I didn't. Boone, however, did. He ambled toward the fence at a slow, deliberate pace. The crew zoomed in on him as Karen began one of her monologues about neighborly safety, but she faltered when Boone stopped a foot from the fence and snorted hard, shaking dust from his hide. She took a step back, then another. The inspector whispered something to her. The camera crew lowered their lenses, and they left. That night, Ellis called. "We got a court date, 3 weeks. You think she'll show?" "Oh, she'll show. She'll have to. And when she does, we bury them in documentation." I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anxiety. From anticipation. 3 weeks wasn't just a countdown to a legal hearing. It was a countdown to something I'd been denied for months. Respect. Because you can push a man for only so long. You can twist the narrative, scream at the top of your lungs, fine him, insult his land, and try to break his livelihood. But at some point, the land pushes back. And so do the bulls. The morning of the second incident started like any other, crisp, golden light cresting over the hills. Boone already leading the herd toward the southern trough, and my coffee steaming beside the barn ledger. I had just started sketching out repairs for the east fence post when I heard the unmistakable whine of a vehicle engine too far inside my perimeter. It was happening again. I dropped the pen through on my cap and hustled toward the pasture trail boots pounding dry earth. I knew before I saw it that something had gone wrong. I could feel the tension crawling up the back of my neck. Sure enough, I crested the hill and spotted her. Karen's SUV, mangled but somehow operational, sitting dead center in the field. Only this time, she wasn't inside it. She was standing outside the vehicle with 2 men in suits and what looked like a large camera rig. Her arms were flailing, pointing toward the bulls grazing 50 yards away. One of the men, tall, maybe 30, beard neatly trimmed, was positioning the camera toward Boone and Tex. And just like that, it clicked. They were filming. They weren't here by accident. This was a setup. Some kind of PR stunt to counteract the damage from the viral conservation video. Maybe an expose on rogue landowners or dangerous livestock. Whatever it was, they hadn't asked permission, and they sure as hell didn't have a clue what they'd just stepped into. Boone was watching them. He'd raised his massive head eyes, locked in ears forward. The rest of the herd was stirring behind him, shifting uneasily, snorting low. They didn't like cameras, they didn't like shouting, and they definitely didn't like strangers. Karen turned toward the cameraman and yelled something I couldn't hear over the wind, but I saw the moment everything went sideways. The camera operator stepped forward, past a clear "no trespassing" wildlife zone sign. Karen followed, waving a bright red binder in her hand, her voice pitching upward in the worst possible frequency. That's when Tex let out a warning grunt, low, thunderous, primal. I sprinted. I had no weapon, no cattle prod, just my voice. "Stop!" I shouted, hands cupped to my mouth. "Back away slowly." The two men turned, startled, but Karen didn't. She kept walking, flashing that HOA badge like it meant something to a 1,000-pound beast with bone-thick horns and territorial rage. Boone took a single step forward, then another. The ground shook. The cameraman screamed. Tex bellowed, and in one blur of hooves and heat, chaos erupted. The herd surged not mindlessly, but with force. Boone charged toward the SUV, lowering his head and slamming into the front grille with a sound like a cannon shot. The car flipped partially onto its side wheels, spinning midair. Karen stumbled backward, arms pinwheeling, just barely avoiding the collapsing door. The two cameramen bolted, camera abandoned, but Boone wasn't after them. Tex had locked in on Karen, not because he understood what she represented, but because her flailing, shrieking, scent-fueled panic painted her as a threat. I ran harder, lungs burning, cutting a diagonal line toward the herd's flank. Karen fell. Not hard, but enough to make her scream like the world was ending. Tex was 10 yards away and closing. "Boone, Tex, hold," I roared. To this day, I don't know what made Boone stop. Maybe it was my voice. Maybe it was the way Karen lay crumpled in the dust, sobbing. Maybe he just knew it wasn't a fair fight. But Tex slowed, snorted, pawed the earth once, then turned his massive body and trotted back toward the group. Karen lay there shaking. I reached her a few seconds later, dropping to one knee beside her. "Are you hurt?" She didn't answer, just stared at the sky, eyes wide, lips trembling. I called 911. And then, while we waited for the ambulance, I walked over to the SUV. The front end was wrecked, the hood bent like an accordion. But in the wreckage, I saw something else. A tripod, a wireless mic, and a lapel pin still broadcasting. This wasn't an inspection. This was an ambush. The EMTs arrived within 15 minutes. Karen was alert but rattled, crying into the arms of the female medic as they helped her into the rig. She didn't speak to me. Not a single word. The sheriff's deputy arrived next, and I showed him everything: the signs, the cameras, the footage already auto-uploaded to the cloud. I gave him timestamps, GPS markers, and footage from the drone that showed the trio crossing multiple warning lines before entering the active herd field. He nodded the whole time, scribbling in his notepad. "This is airtight," he said. "She's going to be mad when she realizes we're not charging you." But the law is the law. As the emergency vehicles rolled away, Ellis called. "I saw the footage," he said. "It's already online. That abandoned camera." It was still streaming. My gut twisted. What? Streaming to the HOA's YouTube channel. Karen was doing some kind of live HOA spotlight, probably meant to show the dangerous conditions. It caught the whole damn thing. I didn't say anything. "Your herd just went viral again," Ellis said. "Only this time you didn't have to say a word." I hung up, walked back to the porch, and sat down heavily. Out in the field, the bison had settled again. Boone stood still, head high, watching the ridge, as if daring anyone else to try. I looked at the camera mounted under the porch eave. Still blinking red. Still recording. And for the first time in weeks, I smiled. Karen hadn't just lost her narrative. She'd handed me the ending to hers. 3 days after the second incident, I received a knock on the door, not a package drop-off or a neighbor stopping by with eggs. This was sharp, rhythmic, official. I opened the door to find a process server, standing awkwardly on my porch like he'd rather be anywhere else. He handed me a thick envelope, muttered, "Have a good day, sir," and retreated faster than Boone did when thunder rolled across the hills. Inside the envelope, the inevitable. Karen was suing me again. This time, the papers were thicker, more aggressive. Instead of a straightforward negligence claim, she was now alleging reckless endangerment, willful failure to secure livestock, emotional trauma, and property destruction. She even included a demand for an emergency injunction to have my entire herd removed from the premises until further review. It was madness, but it was legally filed madness. I set the envelope down slowly and exhaled through my nose. My coffee had gone cold, and the sun had barely cracked through the pines. She had escalated again. I called Ellis, of course. He didn't even need me to explain. Already saw it, he said. It's online. Her HOA blog posted a copy of the suit. She's playing this to the crowd, now not the court. Is there any actual chance they grant an injunction? I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it out loud. Not with the footage we have, but we'll need to respond fast and aggressively. She's banking on pressure, on spectacle. We need to bury her in facts. And we did. Over the next 48 hours, Ellis and his firm crafted a searing legal response fortified by documentation, time-stamped footage, wildlife protection laws, and signed statements from both the Sheriff's Office and the Department of Natural Resources. The best part, we had Karen's own live stream as evidence, uncut, uploaded automatically by the HOA's server. In it, she could be heard saying, "Just keep filming. The bulls won't do anything if we act confident." She'd said that 5 minutes before Tex rammed the SUV. 5 minutes before she fell to the dirt and sobbed into the pasture grass. 5 minutes before her narrative collapsed under the weight of her arrogance. But it got better. Ellis discovered that the HOA had never authorized the live stream. Karen had launched it without board approval. In fact, 2 board members resigned shortly after the video went viral again, leaving a public statement that they were not informed nor supportive of President Whitmore's actions. Marla Jennings called me, voice hushed but urgent. They're having an emergency vote to suspend her tonight. I didn't say anything, just listened. She's losing control, Marla added, and she's going to go down swinging. That night, I sat on the porch with Boone lying 20 feet away, the stars sharp above us and the air thick with pine. I thought about the quiet years before the HOA came knocking. I thought about the patience it takes to raise bison the way they teach you how to be still, how to listen before you act. Karen never listened. She only demanded. And now she was spiraling. The next morning, Ellis called me with a grin I could hear through the phone. "She's trying to file a restraining order," he said, almost laughing. "Against me." "No," he said, "against the bison." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "She filed a motion this morning requesting that the court recognize your bulls as a direct and ongoing threat to community welfare, and demanded they be restrained, removed, or sedated." I stood up, hand on my head. Is that even legally possible? No, it's desperation. But we're going to let the judge see it exactly as is. No edits, no commentary. Just her own words. I didn't have to wait long for the next blow to land. 2 days later, the county court formally dismissed Karen's injunction request, citing overwhelming evidence of her own trespassing and reckless endangerment of protected livestock. The ruling not only denied her motion, it reaffirmed the legitimacy of my land's federal livestock protection status. And then, in a move I hadn't anticipated, the judge added a personal remark at the end of the ruling. The court notes with concern the continued harassment of the landowner by HOA representatives and encourages all parties to refrain from further provocation, both in physical conduct and digital representation. It was subtle, but it was a warning. Karen didn't just lose in court. She lost in front of everyone. But she still wasn't done. The next afternoon, she hosted a press conference right at the edge of Fairview Trail's welcome sign. The HOA backdrop was awkwardly hung behind her. She wore a neck brace, a cast on her wrist, which hadn't been there a week ago, and a look of practiced martyrdom. Her speech was predictable. I have been traumatized not once but twice by uncontrolled animals. This is no longer about me. It's about every family in this community. I will not stop fighting until the bison are removed and until our homes are safe again. It would have been comical if it weren't so dangerous. The rhetoric was loaded. The crowd was small but loyal, 10, maybe 12 people, mostly board loyalists. But the media presence had faded. No major outlets showed. Just a local blog and a teen live streaming it on TikTok. The comments section roasted her alive. Why were you even on his land? The bison live there. You don't. Next time, maybe don't honk at a 5,000-pound animal. It was the beginning of the end. The day after the press conference, Ellis received a letter from Karen's lawyer requesting settlement negotiations, an indirect white flag. She didn't admit fault. She never would. But the lawsuit was dying and she knew it. Ellis looked at me across the table when he told me, "We can end this now. Settle. Confidentiality clause, financial payout, public retraction." I shook my head. "I don't want her money." He smiled. "Then we asked for something else." And we did. The terms were simple. Immediate public withdrawal of all claims against me. A formal apology letter posted to the HOA website. Karen's resignation from the HOA board. And one final clause. The HOA shall never again attempt to exert authority over my land in any form. She signed. 2 weeks later, the letter went live. And Karen Whitmore, she disappeared from Fairview Trails like smoke from a fire finally put out. But I didn't gloat. I just went out into the pasture that night, found Boone under the stars, and whispered, "We're good now, big guy. We're good." And for the first time in a long while, the wind over the ranch felt like peace. The courtroom was small. Tired carpet, flickering fluorescent lights, and wood paneling that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 80s. But none of that mattered, because this wasn't about appearances. This was about setting the record straight in front of a judge under oath, with the full weight of the law finally crashing down where it belonged. Karen was already seated when Ellis and I walked in. She sat at the plaintiff's table, her lawyer beside her, some stiff in a shiny blue suit, who looked more like a car salesman than a litigator. Karen wore another neck brace, though this one looked newer, more padded, as if she were doubling down on the theatrics. She didn't even glance in my direction. Ellis leaned toward me as we sat. "She's going to try to play the victim again. Let her. The footage we have will do the heavy lifting." He was right. The first hour was routine. The judge, a seasoned woman named Honorable Judith Kenner, called the room to order and reviewed the docket. Karen's lawyer led with a dramatic recounting of trauma inflicted upon an innocent public servant, claiming she was lured unknowingly into a hostile agricultural environment and that I had failed to provide adequate fencing signage or precautionary alerts. Ellis didn't even blink. He waited until the lawyer finished his overlong statement before calmly standing. "Your Honor," Ellis said, holding up a thumb drive, "we have time-stamped security footage, multiple eyewitness statements, county zoning records, federal livestock protection documentation, and a live stream video submitted by the plaintiff herself, which directly contradicts these claims." The judge raised an eyebrow. "A live stream?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ellis said. "From the plaintiff's HOA website. It recorded the entire incident in question, unedited." That was the turning point. The clerk uploaded the footage and projected it onto the screen for all to see. There was Karen in full color standing in my field with her entourage. There was her voice, "Just keep filming. The bulls won't do anything if we act confident." There was the moment Boone lowered his head. Techs pacing, the camera crew stepping forward, Karen waving her red binder like a cape in a rodeo, the scream, the SUV getting tossed like a toy. And then, the most damning part, the clear signage on camera as they passed through 2 fences, both marked, "Private property, livestock area. Do not enter. Enter at your own risk." The room was dead silent when the video ended. Even Karen's lawyer looked rattled. Ellis stood. "Your Honor, the footage speaks for itself, but we would also like to submit supplemental testimony from the county's wildlife and agriculture director confirming the livestock's legal status, and from the sheriff's office verifying the chain of events and lack of criminal activity on our client's part." The judge nodded slowly, folding her hands. She turned to Karen. "Ms. Whitmore, do you have any documentation proving you had the defendant's permission to enter his land?" Karen stiffened. "I didn't need permission. I was acting on behalf of the HOA." The judge raised an eyebrow. "But you're aware his land is not within the jurisdiction of the HOA." Karen hesitated. We believed his proximity to HOA property constituted shared environmental impact." The judge turned to Ellis. "Is there a response on file regarding jurisdiction?" Ellis nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Included in our filing is a map with legal boundaries, notarized land surveys, and confirmation from the county recorder's office. The defendant's property lies fully outside the HOA's authority." The judge scanned the file for a long moment. Then she looked back at Karen. "Ms. Whitmore, not only did you enter land that wasn't under your jurisdiction, but you did so on multiple occasions, despite numerous visible warnings. Then, when your actions resulted in foreseeable consequences, you attempted to shift the blame entirely to the property owner." Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The judge continued, voice flat and firm. This court finds no basis for your claims. The case is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, we find grounds for a civil countersuit, which the court will allow to proceed in full. Boom. Karen looked like she'd been hit in the gut. Ellis gave a small nod. We intend to pursue damages for defamation, legal harassment, and trespassing. Karen's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her urgently. She nodded barely and stood up abruptly. Your Honor, she said, her voice strained, we'd like to move toward a private settlement. Judge Kenner glanced at me. Mr. Granger, do you accept that path? I paused. I looked at Karen, her carefully constructed image cracking the cameras gone, her allies distant. No, Your Honor, I said calmly. We've been silent long enough. Let's proceed. The next 2 weeks were a blur of depositions, document reviews, and formal demands. Ellis was surgical. He dug through every message, every newsletter Karen had published. We found drafts of HOA memos accusing me of weaponizing wildlife. We found emails to board members saying we need to scare him into selling. It wasn't just Karen's recklessness. It was intentional harassment. Eventually, under pressure and legal fire, the HOA board turned on her. One by one, members resigned. The board president, who had replaced Karen, submitted a formal apology. They offered a full public retraction and payment of my legal fees. I accepted the apology. I declined the payout. I don't want their money, I told Ellis. I just want peace. Karen, facing mounting legal costs, sold her home and quietly moved out of Fairview Trails. Rumor had it she'd relocated to Florida, some gated community with tighter bylaws and taller fences. Good riddance. I stood at the fence line one evening, weeks after the court victory, staring out at Boone and Tex as they grazed beneath the rising moon. They weren't just animals to me. They were guardians, symbols. They didn't attack, they defended. And in the end, they reminded everyone that nature still has rules, and that if you trespass arrogantly into something you don't understand, you'd better be ready for the consequences. The Bison were not amused, and neither was I. By the time the courtroom dust settled, I noticed something strange happening in Fairview Trails. Silence. No more unmarked cars creeping past my fence. No more late-night phone calls from blocked numbers. No more HOA newsletters slipped under my gate, declaring me a menace to community safety. Karen was gone, and with her the grip she'd had on the board evaporated like summer dew. But that didn't mean I was done. What she had put me through, what she had attempted to take, couldn't be brushed away with a retraction letter and a forced apology. I wasn't after revenge, not exactly, but I was after accountability. And I was going to get it the same way I'd survived every war courtroom and conflict life ever threw at me, methodically, legally, and without blinking. Ellis and I moved forward with the civil countersuit, now free from the burden of defending ourselves. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every future landowner who'd ever been bullied by a paper tyrant hiding behind HOA letterhead. We filed for trespassing on federally protected land, defamation of character, emotional distress, attempted interference with agricultural operations, and we weren't shy about it. The suit wasn't just against Karen, it named the HOA itself as a body that had, under her leadership, approved and supported the harassment. We requested punitive damages, an official policy change banning HOA involvement with adjacent non-member properties, and a publicly documented board restructuring. The board tried to settle quietly. They offered money again, more this time, but I refused. You can't pay off the truth, I told them in mediation. You write it down, you admit it, you fix it. The pressure mounted. Public interest was growing again, and this time not in Karen's favor. A local investigative journalist began running a multi-part series called HOA versus Homesteader, detailing how common it was for HOAs to illegally extend their influence into neighboring private properties. My story wasn't just a story anymore. It was a case study. Eventually, the board caved. They agreed to every term. Full acknowledgement of overreach. Updated bylaws, stating they would never again pursue enforcement actions on properties not formally within HOA boundaries. Mandatory board training on property rights and county-level jurisdiction. And most importantly, a written, signed, and notarized apology, posted on their website and mailed to every resident. The letter read in part, We recognize that the actions taken against Mr. Granger were inappropriate, unlawful, and inconsistent with our commitment to neighborly respect. We apologize for the distress caused and affirm that his property lies entirely outside the purview of this HOA. We thank Mr. Granger for his dignity in defending his rights and his stewardship of protected livestock. It was surreal to read. Even more surreal to stand on my porch, coffee in hand, as Marla Jennings walked up one morning with tears in her eyes and said, "You did it. You actually did it." "No," I said gently. "We did. Boone did. Tex did. The land did. But there was one more thing I had to do. Turn the narrative forward." In the weeks following the settlement, I partnered with Bill Ramirez and Dr. Meredith Klein, the wildlife director and conservationist who had supported me, to create something permanent. We launched the Bison Borderlands Initiative, a small public program focused on educating communities near agricultural zones about living with wildlife, understanding property law, and most importantly, knowing the limits of HOA authority. We held the first workshop at my ranch. I watched as kids sat cross-legged in the grass near the fence, listening wide-eyed, as Dr. Meredith Klein explained how bison had once nearly disappeared from the continent. Boone ambled nearby, unconcerned, munching lazily on prairie grass, while a group of parents snapped photos. Not out of fear, but wonder. The irony wasn't lost on me. A year ago, I was being framed as a threat to the neighborhood. Now I was helping rebuild its understanding of the very thing it had tried to destroy. And as for Karen, I never heard from her again. Not directly. But one of the new board members, young guy, progressive thinker smart, told me over lunch that she'd tried to rejoin another HOA near Tampa. Word got around fast. Her application was denied. Apparently, the bison followed her. Good. I didn't need her to suffer. I just needed people to know that there are limits. Lines you don't cross. Creatures you don't poke. Land you don't trespass upon just because it doesn't fit the symmetry of your lawn. Boone still stands guard near the fence every morning, his scar a reminder of battles fought and won, without raising a gun or a voice, just by holding the line. Tex has grown slower now, calmer, but I've caught him staring toward the ridge, where Karen once stood with her camera crew. He seems to remember. So do I. And every time I look out over the field at the place where her SUV got turned into scrap metal, I smile. Not out of pettiness, but because the land is finally quiet again. Because truth has weight. And when you stand still long enough, rooted deep in that truth, no board badge or blazer can move you. The first true day of peace didn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrived quietly, like sunrise over snow-capped ridges, calm, steady, and warm. I woke to the familiar creak of the windmill spinning in the early breeze. The birds were louder than usual, or maybe I was just noticing them again. There were no tire tracks near the fence, no letters in the mailbox, no news cameras lingering at the county line. Just Boone standing by the west pasture, backlit by morning gold, his silhouette unbothered. That morning, I brewed my coffee and didn't immediately reach for my phone to check for threats updates or legal filings. I didn't have to. Ellis had closed the book on the last of the paperwork 3 days ago. The countersuit was concluded, the settlement honored, and for the first time in almost a year, the HOA's name didn't hover like a storm cloud over my breakfast. It was over. Completely. I saddled up my old Mule Cooper, his arthritic knees still willing if I didn't push, and took the long trail around the southern ridge just to see how far the silence stretched. Everywhere I looked, the land was unchanged. But I wasn't. I was leaner not in body, but in tolerance for nonsense. I'd learned how fragile peace was when placed next to unchecked power, and how fast an innocent fence line could become a battlefield. But I'd also learned something else. That fighting back doesn't always mean fighting dirty. Sometimes it means knowing your rights, standing firm, and trusting that when the truth is loud enough, even the strongest bullies will stumble. I rode back through the north gate just as a familiar truck pulled into the drive. It was Bill Ramirez. He stepped out in his usual uniform, faded jeans, tan shirt with the Wildlife Department logo on the breast, and that same clipped gait from our deployment days. But his face had softened. He held 2 cardboard boxes under one arm. "You planting something?" I asked, hopping down from the saddle. He grinned. Educational signs. Laminated. Durable. State-funded. I opened the first box. Inside were thick wooden placards, each engraved with bold letters. Protected Land Historic Bison Preserve. Entering without written permission constitutes criminal trespass under state and federal law. The second box held brochures, full color. My ranch was on the cover. He slapped a document into my hand next. The county's making your land an official example for future zoning disputes. Training material. I chuckled. Never thought this place would end up in a textbook. Better a textbook than a courtroom, he said. Or another HOA witch hunt. We spent the afternoon installing 2 of the signs by the main road and another near the fence, where Karen's SUV had once sat lopsided and smoking. I left that one intentionally taller than the rest, just a few extra inches, to catch the eye of anyone driving past with entitlement in their veins. After Bill left, I sat on the porch with Boone nearby, his broad shoulders casting long shadows across the gravel. Marla Jennings stopped by later with a mason jar of pear preserves and a note signed by half a dozen Fairview Trails residents. No political speeches, no slogans, just, "We're sorry we didn't speak up sooner. You were right to defend what's yours." I didn't need their apology, but I accepted it anyway. Because peace doesn't come when everyone agrees. It comes when the loudest voices finally learn to listen, or lose the right to speak for others altogether. That night, I lit a fire in the pit, made a cup of strong tea, and watched the stars scatter across the black dome of sky like glitter on velvet. Karen hadn't just tried to take my land. She'd tried to erase my right to live differently, to be outside their system, to let animals roam freely, to honor the past instead of paving it over with manicured lawns and bylaws no one voted for. She failed. And I didn't just win. I endured. In the weeks that followed, the workshops became regular school field trips, visiting conservationists, curious reporters. I kept the tone humble. I wasn't trying to become a folk hero. I just wanted people to remember why we fence in the land, not each other. The Bison became celebrities in their own right. Boone was even featured in a wildlife magazine, his scarred face staring nobly out from the page with the headline, "The Bull Who Held the Line." Tex liked the attention less, but tolerated it. And I swear once or twice I caught him huffing dismissively whenever someone mentioned HOA. Good boy. One afternoon, I received a letter not from a lawyer or journalist, but from a young man named Alex, a new homeowner in a development 2 towns over. He wrote, "I didn't think I had a right to fight back. Then I heard your story. Now I do." That was it. Not a victory parade, just impact. One line at a time. The land is quiet now, but not empty. It holds the echo of a battle won, not through fury, but through patience, through law, through standing still when others screamed and walking forward, only when the path cleared. So now when I close the gate behind me at night and hear the low breathing of Boone and the others beneath the stars, I feel something I hadn't in a long time. Not just safety, not just justice, but home. And if anyone ever asks me again why I fought so hard over fences and bulls and land that most people would have given up, I'll point out across the pasture, smile slow and say, "'Cause no one has the right to tame what was never theirs."